The courtroom fell silent the moment Karoline Leavitt stepped up to the witness stand. Every eye, from the bailiffs at their stations to the spectators in the gallery, locked on her determined expression. She had arrived that morning dressed in a tailored lavender blazer, as composed as if attending a press briefing, not a high-stakes trial. Whispers swept through the room. Karoline's testimony could change everything. People remembered her as a rising political strategist, once celebrated, now poised to turn the tides against one of the most powerful figures in entertainment. Across from her, seated at the defense table, sat Sean "Diddy" Combs, his usual swagger replaced by a measured calm, though his fingertips tapped a faint rhythm against the mahogany surface. A hush spread when Judge Frank Caprio entered, the gavel's echo signaling that the moment of reckoning had arrived. Somewhere hidden in his walrus mustache, Caprio's compassionate heart pulsed, ready to weigh evidence against empathy. And as Karoline inhaled, the audience leaned forward, wondering, would her words shatter Diddy's defense entirely? Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss stories like this. When Diddy first arrived in Judge Caprio's courtroom, everything seemed to shift. The hushed murmurs softened, the scrape of chairs against the polished floor stilled, and the bright morning light that filtered through the tall windows glinted off marble surfaces as if spotlighting his entrance. He walked in wearing a charcoal gray suit, precisely tailored to drape over his broad shoulders, and the fabric rippled under the overhead lamps, momentarily catching the light in silvery flashes. Under his sleeve, a Breitling watch peeked out, its polished face sparkling as he offered a respectful nod to Bailiff Martinez, who stood sentinel by the door in his crisp black uniform and white gloves. Martinez returned the nod with a curt head tilt. He knew who Diddy was. Everyone here did. But in this room, celebrity held no sway over the process of justice. Several heads in the gallery turned when Diddy crossed the threshold. A woman in the third row whispered to her neighbor, "Is that really him, Sean Combs?" Her friend leaned forward, eyes wide. A teenage boy, perched on the edge of one of the narrow benches, stared as if this were the climax of a concert he'd waited years to attend. Yet among the onlookers, journalists with notebooks, legal observers with clipboards, locals drawn by rumors, there were also those who barely glanced up, accustomed to high-profile figures wandering in and out of courtrooms. Still, the collective energy in the chamber crackled like static electricity. His strides were both deliberate and deceptively casual, like someone accustomed to grand stages, even when walking into something far more daunting. He reached the defense table, an expanse of polished oak, where his attorney, Marcus Shaw, sat hunched over a packet of notes. Shaw looked up, offered a reassuring nod, and then bent to whisper something into Diddy's ear. Though the words remained private, Diddy's slight grin seemed to blend relief with resolve. He pulled out the chair for himself, the legs scraping softly against the floor, and eased down into it. From the corner of his eye, Diddy caught sight of Karoline Leavitt sitting across the aisle, near the prosecutor's table. She wore a light blue silk blouse beneath a well-fitted navy blazer, her hair tied back in a neat chignon. Her expression was composed, almost unreadable, but Diddy recognized the slight tension in her jaw. It was the same tension he'd seen countless times in news clips. He offered her a faint, almost wistful nod, as though acknowledging that their shared past now placed them here on opposite sides of a pivotal moment. Karoline returned the nod quickly, unfazed, but her eyes lingered on him a heartbeat longer. The bailiff, Martinez, motioned for silence. His booming voice filled the room. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Frank Caprio." Chairs scraped as everyone stood. Diddy rose with a practiced fluidity, adjusting his tie as he did so, a charcoal silk tie patterned with tiny white dots, and allowed himself a subtle, self-deprecating smile. This smile vanished the instant he reached attention. He enclosed a quick glance for Judge Caprio, who was already descending the elevated dais at the far end of the room. Judge Caprio entered wearing his black robe, crisp white collar peeking out. Even in judicial robes, his presence felt warm rather than forbidding. He paused on the bench, gave a small nod to Diddy, and the corners of his mouth turned up in a gentle chuckle. "Mr. Combs, please be seated. We have much to cover today," he said in a voice that was both firm and inviting, like a teacher about to begin a lesson. Diddy seated himself, exhaling lightly as the weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. As Diddy slid into his chair, he brushed a stray lock of curly hair away from his face, revealing eyes that flickered with a curious mixture of confidence and unease. He tucked one leg under the other, crossed a silver-tipped pen between his fingers, and watched as the courtroom staff adjusted microphones and arranged papers. The jury, seated in a row of wicker-style chairs to the right, leaned forward, whispering among themselves. "He seems too calm, almost rehearsed," one juror murmured to another. Another jury member, a middle-aged man with a salt-and-pepper beard, just blinked, as though uncertain what to make of this larger-than-life figure sitting stoically at the defendant's table. Behind the jury, a handful of Diddy's supporters, friends, employees, perhaps a few investors, wore dark suits and sunglasses, sitting motionless as if in a church pew. One of them, a tall young man with a neatly trimmed beard, tapped his fingers on the knee of his pants, betraying nerves. Others scrolled through their phones, checking social media feeds for reactions. In the rear, a gaggle of photographers craned their camera lenses through the protective grille that separated the public gallery from the courtroom proper, clicking pictures now and then, the shutters sounding like distant raindrops. Meanwhile, Karoline's backers, mostly local activists, former charity volunteers, and a couple of journalists, clutched their folded programs in their laps. Their programs contained trial schedules, witness lists, and small black-and-white headshots of Diddy, Karoline, and other key figures. Occasionally, they would exchange discreet glances with Karoline, offering silent support. She sat poised with her elbows resting lightly on the wooden table in front of her. Beneath the courtroom's hushed atmosphere, faint strains of air conditioning hummed, mixing with the subtle rustle of paper from the stenographer's desk. As Judge Caprio arranged his docket, he tapped a small nameplate on the bench that read, simply, "Judge Frank Caprio." Then, he cleared his throat and looked directly at Diddy. "Mr. Combs," he began, "we understand that the morning has been quite busy for you. If you need a moment before we proceed, you may let us know." He offered a kindly smile that contrasted sharply with the formal tension of the proceedings. Diddy's shoulders relaxed fractionally. He offered a polite shake of his head, indicating he was ready to move forward. "No, Your Honor. Let's begin." A flurry of legal aides and clerks shifted papers, and a plexiglass water pitcher slid silently across the table toward Diddy. He picked up the clear plastic cup and took a measured sip, his gaze roaming over the faces of spectators. He recognized a reporter he'd met once at a music awards after-party, a woman with platinum blonde hair, a cropped blazer, and a notepad in her lap. She lifted her head, pen poised. He met her eyes briefly and offered a subtle nod as if to say, "Be fair." She responded with a curt half-smile that held an unspoken, "I will report every detail." Then came the moment when the dimmer side of celebrity arrived. A young fan peeked over the rail, barely more than a teenager, eyes bright with a mixture of awe and excitement. He likely thought he was behind the glare of a barricade. He was several rows back, but Diddy leaned forward, lifted his hand grandly, and said, "What's going on, young man?" There was a flush of color in the teenager's cheeks as he stuttered, I'm like your biggest fan, sir." With that, Diddy offered him a quick wave, no words, just a gesture of acknowledgement, before settling his palms back on the table. The teenager sank back into his seat, trembling with something like pride. Over to the left, the bailiff watched this informal exchange with crisp professionalism. Martinez straightened his posture and tapped his clipboard, a small reminder to all that decorum remained intact. Martinez's presence lent a sense of gravitas, an unspoken signal that, despite the celebrity theatrics, this was a courtroom governed by rules. Beside Martinez stood a court reporter, her fingers poised above the stenotype machine, ready to capture every syllable. Her eyes were sharp, glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She tapped a few keys to warm up, the staccato rhythm echoing softly in the silent air. In that moment, Diddy's fan exchange, the murmur of cameras, the rustle of papers, a curious warmth settled over the courtroom. It was the kind of warmth that Judge Caprio appreciated most, the reminder that even in the most serious settings, humanity and compassion had a place. He glanced at Diddy, offered a faint shrug, and added with a wry smile, "I suppose it's not every day we have a musical legend in our midst." A ripple of laughter, quiet but genuine, swept around the room. Then, with a flick of his wrist, Caprio tapped the gavel once, twice, and the laughter faded, replaced by solemn attention. Around Diddy, the tension returned. He met Judge Caprio's gaze with a curt nod, set the cup down, and placed both large hands flat on the table, fingers interlaced. The faint hum of overhead fans accompanied the judge's next words. "Will counsel please introduce themselves for the record?" The courtroom clerk leaned forward and asked for introductions. On Diddy's side, his attorney stood. "Marcus Shaw, Your Honor, representing Mr. Combs." On Karoline's side, a poised woman in a pinstriped skirt suit rose. "Elena Ramirez, Your Honor, for the state." Each spoke clearly, their voices echoing as if bouncing off the high ceilings, then resumed their seats. The judge checked his notes, silently reviewing the day's agenda. Diddy leaned back, wincing as the old vinyl seat creaked. He allowed his eyes to wander around the room, toward the side windows where sunlight glinted off dew-soaked trees outside, toward the American flag standing sentinel in the corner, and toward the crest carved into the wall behind Caprio's bench, an eagle, wings spread, clutching arrows and olive branches. That crest was a symbol of balance, of justice tempered by peace. For a moment, Diddy looked as if he were composing a thought for a new song rather than bracing for legal cross-examination. The spectator gallery behind Karoline's supporters included a mix of local residents whose children had participated in the very programs that were now at issue. A woman in her early 60s with silver hair had tears in her eyes as she recalled her granddaughter's dreams of becoming a teacher, nurtured by those after-school classes. Nearby, a bespectacled man in a charity-branded t-shirt shifted in his seat, a look of regret passing across his face. If only the funds had arrived on time, he thought, some of those kids might have had a brighter future. The courtroom felt suffused with those unspoken stories, lingering like a fragrance behind closed doors. At Diddy's defense table, his support team included not only lawyers, but also a private investigator, a young man carrying a laptop covered in stickers, most of them musical icons. The investigator tapped keys furiously, as if preparing for last-minute strategy. Behind him, a burly bodyguard in a dark suit and earpiece scanned the windows and corridors at every pause, ensuring no threats approached. In that very instant, a court clerk passed by with a large stack of manila folders, each containing evidence exhibits, photocopies of financial documents, redacted transcripts of phone calls. The judge beckoned the clerk to place them on Diddy's table, and so the mountain of paperwork grew. Diddy's gaze dropped to the folders for a moment, as though assessing which document might upend his world. Then he looked up again, catching Karoline's eye. She nodded almost imperceptibly, a small gesture of solidarity toward the families whose stories she planned to tell. Diddy's nod back carried layers of shared history. Friend, colleague, confidant, they had once collaborated closely on fundraising campaigns and public relations blitzes. Now, he wore the knowledge that her allegiance had shifted in the most consequential way possible. Their silent exchange filled the space between them with charged emotion, regret, defiance, and a fragile thread of mutual respect that even this confrontation could not sever. In the front row, an elderly couple, perhaps in their 70s, sat side by side, leaning on each other slightly. They had come, they said, because they had donated to the foundation years ago when Diddy first launched it. They felt compelled to be present, to bear witness to how someone they once admired declined or redeemed himself. The man's tweed jacket clashed gently with the woman's soft lavender scarf. They whispered that they hoped justice would be served, but they also wondered whether a public apology or a suspended sentence might truly help their community. Their voices were hushed enough not to disturb the court, but the undercurrent of their concern added to the palpable tension. Across the aisle, another pair of spectators sat, a mother and daughter, the daughter, maybe 15, clutching a charity t-shirt emblazoned with the program's logo. "Achieve Forward," it read, above a stylized torch. The daughter's eyes were red from crying earlier. She had been a recipient of the program, and her dreams of attending college had dimmed when the local center closed. She looked down at her mother, who squeezed her hand reassuringly. It was the first time the girl had seen Diddy in person, yet it carried a heavy weight. The face of the man she blamed for the promises that betrayed her. The judge's clerk made a notation in a small leather-bound book, perhaps alert to these subtle emotional currents, then moved to arrange exhibits for the first witness. Yet, before proceedings could begin in earnest, Judge Caprio paused. He leaned over his bench, addressed Diddy with a warm but firm tone. "Mr. Combs, I have been informed that you'd like to make a brief statement." Diddy's eyebrows rose in mild surprise. This was an unplanned moment. He cleared his throat, adjusted his posture, and spoke, his voice resonating throughout the room. "Thank you, Your Honor," he began, shoulders squared. "I want the record to reflect that I have cooperated fully, and I am here today to answer questions honestly. I understand the gravity of these allegations, and I intend to assist the court in uncovering the truth." His words hung in the air, measured and deliberate. Some jurors leaned back, exchanging looks of curiosity. That intonation, was it genuine contrition or another layer of tactical grace? Judge Caprio nodded, gave a subtle smile, and said, "Very well, Mr. Combs, that will be noted. Counsel may proceed with opening statements when ready." With that, he tapped the gavel softly, and a low hum of papers and shifting feet signaled the transition from atmosphere to action. Yet, in those moments, those final seconds before the legal engines roared to life, the court felt charged not only with procedural formality, but with a unity of purpose, to uncover truth, deliver justice, and perhaps to restore a measure of faith in compassion amidst the glare of celebrity. As Diddy folded his statement into the top file, he took another sip of water, calibrated his breathing, and positioned his pen at the ready. His attorney leaned in once more to whisper adjacencies of strategy. The bailiff straightened, poised to maintain order. The jurors set aside their speculation, and the gallery braced itself for the formal unveiling of evidence. Outside, in the corridors, a television news crew adjusted their camera, preparing to broadcast live once the verdict was announced later that day. But inside, the moment was singular. A famous man, who had once seemed invincible, sat vulnerably in the same place as anyone accused of wrongdoing. Judge Caprio's warm eyes swept over Diddy and the others, signaling a rare invitation to humanity within the rigid machinery of the courthouse. And as the first witness was called, the tension that had simmered beneath the surface burst into focused intensity. Every gesture, every glance, every whispered breath mattered now. In that charged courthouse, where anticipation and tension entwined, people sensed that they were on the brink of witnessing not just a trial, but a profound unfolding of truth, accountability, and perhaps redemption. The bailiff's gavel fell once more, signaling the start of formal proceedings. The wooden echo reverberated through the courtroom, demanding attention. Judge Caprio, seated behind his bench, adjusted the papers before him. His gaze swept the room, ensuring every face, prospective jurors, spectators, attorneys, was attentive. The bright morning sun filtered through the tall windows, spotlighting the assembled crowd like a stage set. At the center of this tableau sat Sean "Diddy" Combs, his posture erect, eyes steeled for what would come. The gavel's echo lingered, then the bailiff announced, "Case number 24, CR 112. The State of Rhode Island versus Sean "Diddy" Combs, charged with conspiracy to defraud and embezzlement against a charitable foundation." A hush descended, as though the very air held its breath. On one side of the courtroom, Prosecutor Elena Ramirez rose. A woman in her mid-30s, she wore a charcoal skirt suit that fit her like armor, tailored, unyielding. She steadied herself behind the podium, buttoning the sleeves of her blazer. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight chignon, and her eyes, framed by subtle eyeliner, gleamed with resolve. In measured tones, she addressed the court. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here to reveal a multi-million-dollar scheme orchestrated by Mr. Combs, an alleged scheme purporting to funnel charitable donations for underprivileged youth into personal accounts. Today, you will hear how Mr. Combs's influence and star power were weaponized to deceive generous donors." Her voice, steady and clear, carried an undercurrent of righteous indignation. She paused deliberately, eyeing each juror to ensure her message landed. This was not merely a financial dispute, but an act of betrayal against children who needed help. Across the aisle, Diddy's attorney, Marcus Shaw, rose immediately after Ramirez finished. Shaw, in his late 40s, projected an aura of relaxed confidence. He wore a midnight blue suit, crisp white shirt, and a simple silver tie clip. His salt-and-pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and a faint 5 o'clock shadow lent him a distinguished air. He faced the jury with arms uncrossed, leaning forward slightly as though engaging an audience at a town hall rather than a courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth and reassuring, "my client has dedicated a lifetime to philanthropy, building an empire that uplifted communities. This prosecution rests on conjecture and hearsay." He let the impact of that phrase linger. "We will prove that any transactions in question were legitimate donations, fully traceable, and above board." As Shaw spoke, his measured cadence and steady gaze sought to disarm any doubt, painting Diddy not as a fraudster, but as a philanthropist caught in a maelstrom of misunderstanding. At the back of the courtroom, Karoline Leavitt sat with her notes neatly stacked on the witness table beside the prosecution. Her expression was thoughtful, betraying a quiet confidence. She had glanced briefly at Ramirez as Shaw concluded, offering her a curt nod before returning her attention to Diddy. That brief exchange underscored their alliance, prosecutor and key witness, united in pursuit of the truth. Judge Caprio turned to the clerk. "Will the courtroom clerk please swear in the jury?" The clerk stood, cleared his throat, and approached the jurors, whose faces reflected a mixture of solemn duty and mild trepidation. One by one, they repeated the oath. "Do you solemnly swear to render a true verdict, based on evidence, so help you God?" Their voices rang in unison, echoing off the high ceiling. With the jurors officially sworn, the trial could proceed. Prosecutor Ramirez rose, nodded to the clerk, and then summoned her first witness, Tim, Coach McAllister. A hush rippled through the spectators as the bailiff escorted him to the stand. Coach McAllister, tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that bore the kind of lines earned through decades of outdoor work, took his oath. He paused before settling into the witness chair. His eyes were gentle, yet edged with a toughness that spoke of resilience. He cleared his throat and surveyed the jury before beginning. "Good morning," Coach said, his voice gravelly but warm. "I'm Tim McAllister. Some folks just call me Coach. I was the youth program director for Achieve Forward Foundation from 2019 to 2022. He gestured to the screen behind him, where Ramirez had cued her first exhibit, a chronological timeline of the foundation's funding commitments and disbursements. "I can confirm that Mr. Combs pledged a $10 million grant to our after-school programs in 2021, he continued, turning to face the jury directly. "We had a signed agreement, a letter on his foundation's letterhead. It was supposed to cover renovations to our community center, hire additional staff, and expand our outreach to inner-city neighborhoods." Ramirez clicked a remote, and the screen displayed a scanned copy of the signed pledge, Diddy's name emblazoned in bold script under the foundation's logo. "Coach McAllister, can you confirm that this document is accurate?" Ramirez asked. Coach nodded firmly. "Yes, ma'am. I was there the day Mr. Combs visited our center in Providence. He stood on a folding chair, addressed the kids, and handed me this agreement in person." The jury leaned forward, eyes fixed on Coach's steadfast demeanor. Ramirez changed the slide to show a ledger page, rows of numbers, dates, account labels. She pointed at a highlighted line. "According to your records, Coach, the agreement was for $10 million, yet the entries show only $2 million deposited, and that amount was transmitted to a different account altogether. Can you explain what happened?" Coach swallowed, his throat bobbing as he gathered his words. "We received $2 million in July of 2021. It was deposited into our main operational account, but the remaining $8 million never arrived. I called the foundation's treasurer repeatedly, but the emails went unanswered." He paused, glancing toward Diddy's table, where Diddy sat perfectly still, jaw set. The signed agreement indicated those $8 million were earmarked for capital improvements, new computer labs, a library makeover, and increased staffing. But when our construction bids came in over budget, we had to halt work. A murmur rippled through the jury box. Work had stalled, children were left waiting, and trust had been shaken. Ramirez clicked again. A bar chart displayed donor contributions versus expenditures. "Coach McAllister, how did you first notice the discrepancy?" He squinted at the screen, as though recalling a distant memory. "It was late October. We'd already spent the $2 million on renovating the gym and hiring extra tutors. But when I requested a detailed financial update, I saw no record of additional funds. Our executive director, Terrence Young, was also confused. He told me, 'Tim, something's off. We never got those funds.' When Shaw signaled an objection, 'Speculation, Your Honor,' Judge Caprio responded gently, 'Overruled. The witness may continue.' His tone conveyed respect for Coach's experience and Ramirez's line of questioning. Coach proceeded, 'I tried to reach Mr. Combs directly through his foundation's office, but calls went to voicemail. Eventually, I sent a text message to a number I had for Mr. Combs. He responded saying, 'Coach, I'll fix it. Trust me.' He didn't specify when or how. That was the last I heard." He paused, letting the weight of unfulfilled promise settle on the jury. Behind him, the ledger slide lingered, a visual testament to missing millions. At that point, Ramirez played an audio recording. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly, and a hush fell. On the screen, subtitles appeared as Karoline's crisp voice filled the room, captured during a Zoom call from months earlier. Karoline: Sean, these numbers don't add up. The donors are asking for receipts. We can't keep telling them to trust us if there's no follow-through. Diddy, voice slightly muffled: Karoline, I told you, move the date. Just backdate the receipts. They'll never check. I'm on it. The recording's last seconds faded into silence. Diddy's jaw tightened, and his attorney Shaw took a quick note, fingers tapping on the table. Ramirez allowed a respectful moment before returning focus to Coach, then asked, Coach McAllister, did you later discover the accounts where the delayed funds were directed? Coach hesitated, glancing into the jury's rapt faces. Yes, ma'am. After several more calls to the treasurer went unanswered, I contacted an accountant friend who traced digital transactions. We found that the promised funds were routed into an account labeled Combs Acquisitions LLC, essentially a private holding account. That came to light in early 2022, just as our construction contract went into default. The jury members exchanged glances: unfulfilled commitment, misdirection of funds, broken promises. When Coach concluded, the judge turned to Shaw. Cross-examination. Shaw rose, buttoning his jacket as he approached the stand. Coach McAllister, thank you for your service to the community and for your candor. You said you relied on third-party accountants. Is it fair to say you never directly managed the charity's financial accounts? Shaw's tone was calm, respectful, as if he were speaking to an old friend rather than a witness painting his client in a negative light. Coach nodded slowly. Yes, that's correct. Our foundation's board appointed, let's call them, independent accountants. I was in charge of programming, not bookkeeping. Shaw leaned in, one hand resting gently on the witness stand. So it's possible there were legitimate explanations for the discrepancies: startup expenses, administrative costs, or banking processing delays, none of which would necessarily indicate intentional wrongdoing on Mr. Combs's part? The coach glanced toward Ramirez, who had leaned forward in her chair, eyebrows knit. Then he looked back at Shaw. I suppose reconciliation could explain some differences, but in this case, the documents didn't reconcile. We had copies of donation receipts dated months after his pledge, but no funds in our account until much later. $2 million in July, despite the agreement in February. Shaw exhaled quietly, nodding. Understood. Now, Coach, you mentioned that Mr. Combs sent you a text. Any evidence that this conversation was recorded or saved, or did you rely on memory? Coach paused, uncertainty flickering across his face. I might have saved it, but I can't be certain where that file is. It's not in my phone now, but I remember the substance clearly. Shaw turned back to the jury, raising a hand slightly. No further questions. Thank you, Coach McAllister. The coach returned to his seat, lingering only a moment to touch the left side of his chest, as if steeling himself for the next witness. At precisely 12 minutes past 5, Ramirez introduced her next witness, Karoline Leavitt. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. The spectators leaned forward, whispering to one another. Here comes Diddy's former PR chief. Karoline rose with a quiet dignity. Dressed in a black pencil skirt and a soft pink blouse, she carried herself like someone accustomed to command attention. She walked up to the stand with measured steps and swore the oath, then fixed her gaze on the jury. My name is Karoline Leavitt, she began, her voice steady. I served as Director of Public Relations and Development for the Combs Family Foundation from 2018 until my resignation in June 2023. She placed her hands lightly on the lectern, her fingers brushing the edge of a stack of documents. In my role, I was responsible for drafting donor proposals, coordinating press releases, and overseeing community outreach events. As she spoke, images of glossy charity gala photos illuminated the projection screen. Smiling children, Diddy shaking hands with local politicians, and Karoline in the background fielding camera crews. The jury watched these images with rapt attention. The innocence of charity contrasted starkly with the allegations at hand. Shaw objected immediately. "Calls for hearsay, Your Honor," he said, his voice firm but polite. Judge Caprio raised a hand, signaling him to pause. "Mr. Shaw, how is this hearsay? Ms. Leavitt is testifying based on her first-hand experience." Turning to Karoline, he added, "Proceed." Ms. Leavitt Karoline nodded and continued without missing a beat. "Thank you, Your Honor. In January 2022, I attended a foundation board meeting with Mr. Combs and the treasurer. We were reviewing our budget. At one point, Mr. Combs asked me to adjust the donation receipts to reflect contributions we had not yet received in full." She paused, letting the words sink in. He said, and I quote, "Karoline, just make the numbers work. Nobody will question it when I say so." A hum of disbelief rippled through the jury box. Diddy's jaw tightened. He leaned slightly forward, elbows on the table, his gaze fixed on Karoline. The room held its breath. Karoline carried on, undeterred by her former employer's reaction. "That day, I felt a knot in my stomach. We had a gala fundraiser scheduled for the following week. Parents would be bringing their children, expecting to see new technology labs and renovated classrooms. I knew we didn't have the funds in our account to pay contractors." She took a breath, eyes steady. "So I followed his instruction, backdating receipts to show $3 million had been received in December, when in reality, we had only collected $1.2 million. The jury stared, some exchanging glances, others scribbled notes. Ramirez clicked to display a side-by-side comparison. The genuine bank record showing $1.2 million and the doctored receipt listing $3 million. The difference was glaring, a digital mirror exposing the deception. Shaw rose again, this time more assertive. "Ms. Leavitt, isn't it true that you resigned in frustration and now hold a personal grudge against Mr. Combs? Perhaps you fabricated these allegations out of spite." He leaned forward, tone measured but sharp. Karoline's gaze did not waver. "No, Mr. Shaw. I resigned because I refused to be complicit in deceiving donors and harming children's futures. My concern has never been personal. It has always been for the kids and families who trusted us." At that moment, a juror in the front row, a woman with tightly coiled hair and a kind face, nodded almost imperceptibly. The judge allowed the slight tension to linger for a beat, then called for a short recess. As the bailiff at the back of the courtroom announced, 10-minute recess, spectators rose, stretching legs and whispering among themselves. Some turned to gaze at Karoline, offering small nods of support. Others murmured to friends, "I can't believe she's going after Diddy so directly." Diddy lowered his head slightly, running a hand through his hair. Shaw leaned in, whispering words of counsel, but Diddy barely seemed to hear. In his mind, he replayed Karoline's testimony, her voice unwavering, her memory vivid. Across the aisle, Ramirez consulted with Karoline, flipping through her notes. They exchanged a small, private smile, a moment of shared confidence. The jury filed out, clutching notebooks, perhaps eager to deliberate on what they had just heard. In the gallery, the spectators buzzed quietly. "She's confident. I can't believe someone is testifying against Diddy." The reporter with the notepad scribbled furiously, "Key witness, Leavitt, make numbers work." Outside the corridor, TV cameras were being set up for live coverage once word spread. But for now, in this closed chamber, the case felt far from settled. Each side had scored points, yet the truth remained obscured by conflicting loyalties and the weight of celebrity. At precisely 1500 hours on the courtroom clock, the bailiff's voice summoned everyone back. The jury returned, scanning the room with serious expressions. Judge Caprio tapped the gavel lightly, restoring order. He offered a brief, solemn nod before instructing, "Counsel, we will resume with rebuttal arguments momentarily. Let's proceed." Although the recess had been short, something profound had shifted in those 10 minutes. The prosecution had laid bare the financial discrepancies and personal betrayals. The defense's attempts at casting doubt had only sharpened focus on the central question: did Diddy knowingly divert funds meant for children into private hands? As proceedings resumed, the gallery's energy felt electric. Anticipation mingled with empathy for Coach McAllister and Karoline, amazement at how celebrity and charity intersected, and the weight of a decision that would ripple far beyond the courtroom walls. Each person present understood that this was more than a legal battle. It was a moral crucible, testing faith, trust, and accountability at the crossroad of influence and integrity. And as Diddy leaned forward in his chair, his eyes steeled, one could sense the gravity of what lay ahead, the pursuit of justice in a case that had begun as a promise of hope, but threatened to end in profound disappointment. When court reconvened after the brief recess, Judge Caprio took his place behind the bench with the air of someone who understood both the gravity of the day's proceedings and the humanity at its heart. His robes swished softly as he settled into his seat. He leaned forward slightly, steepling his fingers, and offered a small, thoughtful nod toward Karoline Leavitt as she returned to her chair. Though her composure seemed unshaken on the surface, there was an intensity in her eyes that made it clear she carried more than mere witness testimony on her shoulders. The courtroom itself felt charged, as if the walls had absorbed every word spoken up to that point and now waited, expectantly, for what would come next. As Elena Ramirez rose to call Karoline back to the stand, the atmosphere shifted from procedural to deeply personal. Ramirez's tone was measured yet urgent. The jury needed to understand that beneath the outline of missing dollars lay an entire constellation of trust, hope, and betrayal. She addressed the jurors directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have already learned how the numbers do not add up, how funds earmarked for underprivileged youth were diverted. But behind those figures is a story of unwavering faith, one young woman's journey from idealism to disillusionment. Today, Ms. Leavitt will share that journey with you." There was a collective intake of breath. Ramirez's invitation to delve deeper had made it clear that this trial had evolved from a financial investigation into a narrative about the human cost of broken promises. Karoline rose and climbed the steps to the witness stand, her posture erect, shoulders squared. Wearing a navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse, she appeared every bit the professional she once was, a woman who had invested her hopes and energy into a cause she believed in. Yet, those same suits, those same credentials, now felt like armor she must shed bit by bit as she prepared to reveal her story. Judge Caprio offered her a warm, encouraging glance. His eyes, the color of worn steel with flecks of kindness, conveyed that he understood the vulnerability required to testify. He seated her and said quietly, "Speak your truth, Ms. Leavitt Karoline." Took a moment, inhaling deeply. She looked at the jury, their faces turned toward her with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Then, with a slight tremor in her voice, she began, "Thank you, Your Honor. When I was 21, just out of college with a degree in communications, I attended a benefit concert in New York City. Mr. Combs was headlining. He called it Rhythm for a Cause. The venue was packed, thousands of people standing shoulder to shoulder, cheering as he introduced guest performers. I was volunteering backstage, handing out water bottles to the crew. When the concert ended, I lingered near a private hallway. I saw Mr. Combs slip through a side door. Something told me to follow. Her voice softened as she recalled that pivotal moment. I approached him, heart pounding. I told him how much I admired his philanthropic efforts, especially the way his foundation had donated laptops to underfunded schools. He turned, smiled broadly, his trademark Grammy grin, and said, "If you ever need a job, reach out." That was the first time I believed I had found my purpose. I thought if someone with his influence wanted me on his team, maybe together we could make a real difference. At that point, the jury leaned in, as if straining to hear more of Karoline's recollection. Even Diddy's own supporters in the gallery shifted in their seats, caught between admiration for Karoline's bravery and curiosity about what she would reveal. Over the next 5 years, Karoline explained, she poured her passion into fostering the very programs she had once observed from the wings. I saw young faces light up at basketball clinics. I heard parents thank Mr. Combs for sponsoring scholarship programs. We launched literacy workshops in local libraries. But, and this is where it starts to unravel, there were things happening behind closed doors that I could not ignore. As she spoke, the lights above her seemed to dull ever so slightly, focusing attention on her earnest expression. One afternoon in the summer of 2021, she continued, voice steadying as she reached a moment that clearly pained her. I walked into the financial office, just to drop off a press release, and found an envelope on the table, unaddressed. I opened it. Inside were checks, unrecorded, in amounts that equaled nearly $500,000. They weren't made payable to us. They were made out to Combs Holdings, LLC. I froze. I didn't know what to do with that information. I thought, maybe, just maybe, it was a processing error. But I wasn't sure. She looked briefly down at her notes, as though ensuring she recalled every detail correctly. I confronted Mr. Combs at the office the very next day. It was after a small donor luncheon, back in his private meeting room. I remember it was hot. The air conditioning had cut out. When I showed him the checks, he rubbed his forehead, sighing. "Karoline," he said, "charity money is flexible if you know how to make it." I blinked, not understanding. I thought he meant investing for greater returns, like putting money into a microfinance program. But then, he continued, eyes weary. "I need to cover some personal debts, rights to a new album. I'll route everything back once the record sells. I just need short-term liquidity." The court auditoriums absorbed her confession, as though the word liquidity itself carried a sting. Karoline's voice cracked momentarily. The jury stared, some chewing their lower lips, others nodding in silent recognition of how easily good intentions could be twisted. Diddy's brows furrowed. He appeared to weigh his own recollection of that conversation. In the gallery, a few supporters looked stunned. A whisper quickly circulated. "I never expected this." Ramirez seized the moment to press forward. "Ms. Leavitt, did those unrecorded checks reach their intended destinations, namely, your office accounts, or did they go elsewhere?" Karoline sighed, a gentle exhale that seemed to carry the weight of betrayal. "They went straight into Combs Holdings. My office did not receive one penny, and because the checks bypassed our finance department's normal channels, there was no digital footprint in the foundation's records." A collective intake of breath swept through the jury as Ramirez continued. "And at that point, how did you feel?" Karoline's shoulders slumped slightly. She reached out as if to steady herself on the witness stand. "I felt sick. I felt naive for trusting him. I felt responsible, like I should have known better than to believe everything I was told. And I felt angry because those funds were supposed to build a community center where children could learn and play. Instead, they were diverted to lines on bank statements." She paused, allowing silence to resonate. The judge's eyebrows knitted together, reflecting empathy for her pain. Ramirez pressed on. "Miss Leavitt, did you ever voice your concerns publicly or to the board?" Karoline's gaze shifted to the jury, capturing their undivided attention. "I told the board's treasurer, Mr. Jones, first. He said he'd look into it, but I saw him whispering with Mr. Combs's personal accountant in the hallway. The following week, I found out that the board was instructed to consider that conversation confidential. They told me not to worry, that internal audits were underway. But nothing changed. I watched as invoices were doctored and checks continued to flow out. I started losing sleep. At that moment, a juror, the young woman in the front row, caught her breath, as though sliding from disbelief to empathy. Another juror, a middle-aged man with a notepad, scribbled rapid notes, checking the timestamp on his phone. Outside the jury box, spectators leaned forward in hushed awe, as though witnessing a confession unfolding in real time. Then, Ramirez guided the questioning toward a particularly haunting anecdote. "You mentioned earlier that you spoke with a single mother, Mrs. Teresa Walker. Can you tell the jury what happened there?" Karoline took a shaky breath, glancing down at the exhibit board behind her, where photos of Ms. Walker and her daughter were displayed. Two smiling faces on a glossy flyer titled, "Achieve Forward, Changing Lives, One Child at a Time." "Yes," she said softly. "Teresa called me in November 2021, sobbing hysterically. She told me her daughter, Brianna, had dropped out of school because she relied on our after-school tutoring program, and the program had shut down mid-year due to lack of funds. I can still hear her voice that day. 'Karoline, how am I supposed to tell my little girl her dream of becoming a teacher has to wait because the money never arrived?' I had to break the news gently, but it felt impossible to console her." Karoline blinked back tears, lip trembling. "I told her, 'Mrs. Walker, I'm so sorry. We don't have the funds.' She screamed into the phone, asking for answers. I had none, just excuses." A hush fell. The judge's chest heaved slightly as he absorbed the weight of that moment. Even the stenographer's fingers paused above the keys, and a faint strain of static from the ancient courtroom speaker system seemed louder suddenly. It was a reminder that financial figures on a spreadsheet represented real lives, real dreams. Shaw rose to cross-examine, but his questions felt perfunctory in the wake of such raw emotion. "Ms. Leavitt, is it not true that, as a charity grows, financial hiccups and administrative oversights occur? It's standard practice for some payments to be delayed. You do understand that, correct?" His voice was measured, more sympathetic than combative, as if he attempted to reclaim some moral high ground for his client. Karoline's lips pressed into a firm line as she responded, "I understand administrative delays in general. But I saw spreadsheets, transactions, and bank statements. I knew something was wrong when rent checks for the facility bounced. That was not a delay. It was a signal that we lacked funds. When the facility's heat was shut off because no one paid the bill, I knew we had crossed a line." Shaw persisted. "And you never personally saw funds deposited into Mr. Combs's account, correct? You only infer what happened from the documents you reviewed." Karoline looked directly at Shaw, then at the jury, her voice unwavering. "I didn't see Mr. Combs's personal bank statements, but I saw where our accounts were supposed to have deposits. There were none. I trusted the finance department, but the pattern was clear. His directives came, and our payments stopped. I didn't need a personal bank statement to know that money meant for our kids ended up somewhere else." The judge allowed her to finish, then called for a brief pause to let the jurors collect themselves. The gallery remained silent, as if absorbing every syllable. Outside in the halls, whispers traveled. "She believed in him. Now look what happened." Some spectators wiped their eyes, others conversed in low tones, processing the depth of Karoline's anguish. The tension in the courtroom felt almost electric, like holding a tightly coiled spring, ready to snap. As Judge Caprio's gavel fell for lunch recess, the air crackled with empathy. The reverberation of the gavel's strike lingered, as if it marked not just a break, but a collective exhalation. Karoline stepped down from the witness stand, and each footfall echoed on the glossy wooden floor. She moved past Diddy. He remained at the defense table, eyes lowered, jaw clenched, as though bracing himself against the tidal waves of revelation. Marcus Shaw placed a comforting hand on Diddy's shoulder, but Diddy's expression remained inscrutable. In hushed tones, the audience members speculated how Diddy would weather this emotional blow. Some felt sympathy for Karoline's story, a founding charm turned weapon by a woman who had once stood by his side. Others wondered whether Diddy would be able to recover from such a moral and emotional pivot. The press scribbled furiously, noting the sharp contrast between the polished star of the stage and the man now forced to confront his own misdeeds in open court. Judge Caprio watched it all with a compassionate hand resting on his chin, pondering the collision of power and conscience that lay at the heart of this trial. He knew that behind every documentary about celebrity trials were real lives altered irrevocably by choices made in boardrooms and private rooms alike. This courtroom, in that charged moment, had become not just a place for legal reckoning, but a crucible exposing raw, unvarnished truth. And as he cleared his throat to call recess, he sensed that the personal saga unearthed by Karoline's testimony would reverberate through the rest of the proceedings, shaping how the jury would weigh facts and how the defendant would reckon with the consequences of betraying trust. In that single stretch of time, 15 to 20 minutes into the trial, the courtroom had transformed. No longer merely a forum to tally sums and balances, it had become a space where ideals were laid bare, where childhood dreams were resurrected and then dashed, and where a once celebrated philanthropist now stood on the brink of answering not only for numbers, but for shattered hopes and broken faith. And as the courtroom emptied for lunch, each person carried away pieces of that story, some filled with indignation, some with sorrow, and many with a profound awareness that even the most well-intentioned mission can be undone by a single bad choice. The trial's journey had just begun, but the emotional stakes had already risen to their highest peak, ensuring that when proceedings resumed, nothing would ever quite feel the same. Judge Caprio's hand hovered over the gavel, but he did not strike it again. Instead, he sat back in his chair, drawing a deep breath as if weighing each syllable of the trial against the gravity of his own conscience. For nearly 10 minutes, the courtroom was suspended in a rare, almost reverential silence. The jurors sat in respectful stillness, their eyes fixed on the judge, even as he gazed past them toward the gallery. Seated there were a tapestry of faces, parents whose children had depended on after-school tutoring, local residents who had staffed the charity's fundraising events, reporters who had covered Diddy's philanthropic ventures for years. Each person waited, collectively holding their breath, sensing that the very essence of justice was being contemplated in real time. The hardwood floor reflected the morning sun streaming through the tall windows, but inside the chamber, the atmosphere felt suffused with a solemn warmth, neither coldly clinical nor ghoulishly sensational, but human to its core. Judge Caprio's steely blue eyes swept slowly from left to right, lingering for a moment on the empty jury box. He saw the young volunteers who had once staffed that same box when they were jury trainees. He thought of the elderly man who had served decades ago and now counseled him in memory, and he felt the weight of every litigant who had ever sat before him. It was a familiar sensation, this moment of stillness before the next turn in a case. But something about this particular trial transcended the usual gravitas. Here, money and celebrity, idealism and betrayal, legal statutes and human suffering had collided in a way that seemed nearly elemental. He felt the pale roar of unspoken stories pressing against the walls. Children whose hopes had coalesced around a promise of learning resources. Families who believed that a famous name could propel their community forward. And one young woman whose heartfelt trust had been used as a tool of deception. Finally, he cleared his throat and rose, letting his robe fall into place around him like an invitation to focus. His voice, when he spoke, was carefully modulated, gentle yet resolute, thoughtful yet leaving no ambiguity about the seriousness of what he would say. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone steady, "we find ourselves confronted with more than ledger entries and legal statutes. This is a matter of integrity, of promises made and promises broken." He paused, giving the jurors a moment to absorb the words. Behind them, the courtroom clerk leaned forward in her seat, pen poised above a blank line, as if waiting to record not just testimony, but a turning point in moral reckoning. Judge Caprio's gaze shifted toward Karoline Leavitt, whose face was lit from above by the courtroom lights. She sat in the witness box, hands folded in her lap, her posture unwavering. He allowed his eyes to rest on her for a heartbeat longer before turning to look at Diddy, seated at the defense table. Diddy's broad shoulders hunched slightly as he met the judge's steady stare. There was tension there, a flicker of regret mingled with defiance. Caprio's next words carried both acknowledgement and challenge. "While the prosecution has clearly outlined the alleged misdirection of funds intended for vulnerable children, we must consider the human toll. The families affected when programs fail, the trust shattered in a young woman who believed in her employer's mission." He held that thought in the room's hush, and it felt as though every person present braced themselves, aware that those words illuminated not just the legal stakes, but the deeper emotional and ethical stakes of the entire trial. In those moments, Caprio's courtroom ceased to feel like a stage for legal maneuvering and transformed into a cathedral of conscience, where each listener became part of a procession of moral deliberation. Yet, he did not allow the moment to drift into mere sentimentality. Caprio leaned forward, fingers steepled as he addressed the subtle tension that inevitably arose when pledges of charity intersected with the lure of personal gain. "I am mindful, too, of the defense's assertion that good intentions must not be undermined by administrative missteps, that charitable work often navigates gray areas." He panned the room to ensure everyone understood that this was no simple matter of paperwork or accounting jargon. Yet, when the line between generosity and personal gain blurs, justice demands clarity. The hush that followed was heavy with understanding. Caprio had effectively acknowledged that charity administration can be messy and that mistakes happen, but he also made it clear that what lay before the court was not a mere clerical error. It was an allegation of deliberate redirection of funds. The jury, composed of men and women from various walks of life, a teacher, a small business owner, a retired nurse, seemed to lean in, grappling with what that implied about Diddy's intentions. Was this a tragic byproduct of a burgeoning nonprofit, or was it a calculated step to enrich oneself at the expense of children's futures? Caprio's voice softened as he turned to the more philosophical dimensions of the case. "The moral dilemma before us asks whether a man's positive contributions to society can absolve him of responsibility if he, in fact, manipulated those very contributions for selfish ends." He let the words hang for a moment, watching how they settled onto each face. Some jurors furrowed their brows, others pressed their lips together. Diddy clenched his jaw, a muscle ticking along his cheek, as if bracing for the weight of that question. We must ask ourselves, does remorse matter more than restitution? Does reputation eclipse reality? The room remained hushed, the subtle hum of the air conditioner the only sound, as if the courtroom itself had paused in order to listen to that provocation. Caprio took another breath, allowing his next thought to reach those who had come seeking both fairness and moral clarity. We must balance compassion against accountability. Yes, Mr. Combs has built a legacy of community investments, some genuine, some questionable. But we cannot allow the shadows of doubt to cancel the light of hope for those whose lives hung on those programs. He paused, glancing first at Karoline, whose taut expression revealed both pride and pain, and then at the rows of spectators, whose excitement, empathy, or skepticism was visible in their eyes. From the back benches where local residents sat quietly, some nodded imperceptibly, as though taking solace in the judge's acknowledgement that the real victims deserved to have their voices heard. At that moment, Caprio chose to draw on his storied experience as a judge, one who had presided over cases ranging from petty misdemeanors to sprawling white-collar criminal trials. "I recall a case early in my career," he said, voice imbued with gentle resonance. "A young immigrant mother was taken before this court because she couldn't pay a minor traffic fine. Her children were at home, ages 5 and 7, waiting for her. She had neglected the fine because she was working 2 jobs to afford rent. Community members rallied, raising the funds to cover her debt, and I dismissed the charges. We recognized that punishment was not serving justice. Compassion was." He let out a soft chuckle. "Some critics said I was too lenient, too soft. But I stand by that decision because the spirit of the law must be to heal, not to break." He paused again, his eyes drifting to a pair of friends who had stood up to embrace that young woman in the gallery. Then he recounted another case. A college student caught shoplifting textbooks because she could not afford her classes. That young woman faced expulsion, but the court imposed community service and mandated that the university library provide extra tutoring, allowing her to graduate. "That student went on to become a teacher in this city," Caprio said, voice thick with affection. "She told me later that she would have dropped out had she been sentenced to jail. Seeing her stand here today, I'm reminded that redemption is possible when accountability aligns with empathy." His words seemed to echo off the wooden panels, resonating in the hearts of jurors and spectators alike. Returning his focus to the present trial, Judge Caprio summarized his core perspective. "In every case, I have sought not only to punish, but to heal. The law must do more than measure paper losses. It must mend broken trust." He leaned back slightly, the leather of his chair creaking softly under the shift of weight. "If any of you find me too lenient," he continued, offering a small, ironic smile, "remember that mercy, like justice, often arrives wearing a humble coat." For a moment, his eyes glittered with the memory of past rulings, of transformations he had witnessed when compassion drove consequences. Even in that moment of reflection, however, Caprio did not lose sight of the demands of the trial ahead. His kindness was never an excuse for negligence. It was a lens through which he evaluated the facts. He raised his hand, lightly tapping the gavel, an invitation for procedural action to resume. "Proceed with the next witness," he instructed. Prosecutor Ramirez rose promptly, clutching her notes with purpose. "Your Honor, the state calls Mr. Alex Mendez, forensic accountant, to the stand." She offered a curt nod toward the bailiff, who went down the aisle and escorted a lean, bespectacled man to the witness stand. Mendez's sleeves were rolled up, his tie slightly loosened, a visual contrast to the suit and tie formality that dominated the courtroom. It was as if he had been crunching numbers late into the night, fueled by coffee and urgency, in order to bring crucial evidence to light. As Mendez accepted the oath and seated himself, Caprio watched him with keen interest. He knew that a forensic accountant's testimony often held the power to pull the lid off hidden transactions, to illuminate what had been obscured in murky spreadsheets. Now, after Karoline's emotional testimony and Coach McAllister's first-hand accounts, the trial was poised to take a technical turn, evidence that mapped a trail of diverted funds from the charity's account into private channels. Mendez cleared his throat. "Your Honor, members of the jury, I have prepared a detailed analysis of the Foundation's financial records from 2020 through 2023. He gestured to a slideshow behind him, showing line graphs, account ledgers, and highlighted entries in red. These highlight discrepancies between pledged donations and actual deposits. They also reveal a pattern. Certain transactions were rerouted to accounts under the name Combs Holdings, LLC. Caprio observed the jury's reactions. Some took rapid notes, while others simply stared at the screen, processing the gravity of the evidence. Diddy's attorney, Marcus Shaw, shifted in his seat, readying himself for rigorous cross-examination. Even Karoline leaned forward, her face alight with both vindication and sorrow. Vindication that the numbers so painfully tallied confirmed her recollections, and sorrow that those funds had indeed been diverted from the children she had tried so hard to protect. As the forensic accountant began to detail his findings, time-stamped entries, matching signatures, digital footprints, the courtroom felt both smaller and infinitely expansive. Smaller, because every witness, every juror, every litigant shared the same space now bound by an intricate web of financial transactions. Infinitely expansive, because the implications of these findings stretched far beyond the arbitration of dollars and cents. They touched on accountability, trust, the obligations of celebrity, and the fate of children who believed in a dream. And so, with Mendez's testimony underway, Judge Caprio's earlier reflections continued to echo through the room. His words had laid the philosophical groundwork. Money mattered, but so did integrity. Numbers were critical, but so too was the emotional toll on those who had suffered. In the next phase of the trial, the prosecution would rely on this forensic clarity to demonstrate that Diddy's charitable legacy had been tainted by deliberate misdirection of funds. The defense, armed with its own arguments, would try to offer alternative explanations, perhaps that the discrepancies were administrative quirks or delays in processing. Yet, as the gears of the court shifted into the technical realm of forensic scrutiny, every listener carried Judge Caprio's central question with them. In the dance between compassion and accountability, how would justice emerge? And could a man's past benevolence shield him from the consequences of choices that harmed those he vowed to help? In that charged moment, this crucible of evidence, emotion, and ethical deliberation, everyone in Caprio's courtroom understood that the trial was no longer merely about a prominent figure's missteps. It had become a crucible for the community's collective conscience, a reminder that behind every dollar, behind every statistic, lay real people whose lives would be forever changed by the outcome. And as the forensic accountant continued to speak, unraveling one complex transaction after another, the judge watched, silent but fully present, ready to shape not only a verdict, but the moral fabric of what justice meant in this place and time. By the time the clock's minute hand edged toward the half-hour mark, the atmosphere in Judge Caprio's courtroom had shifted dramatically. The prosecution rose with deliberate purpose, and Elena Ramirez approached the lectern, a soft click of her files on the mahogany surface marking the moment. Her voice, measured yet charged with anticipation, introduced a new piece of evidence. A financial statement, previously undisclosed, now obtained from an anonymous source. From the gallery to the jury box, eyes snapped to the screen behind her, where rows of financial entries came into view. This document was unlike the earlier spreadsheets and ledgers displayed. It bore handwritten notations, distinct looping characters that matched those seen on Diddy's personal correspondence. Ramirez explained that Karoline Leavitt had been unable to produce this statement until now, not only because it had only recently surfaced, but because she feared the repercussions of revealing it. The jurors leaned forward as the screen zoomed in on a particular line item. $1 million. Transfer to Combs Holdings. Approved by S. Combs. A hush fell over the courtroom as those 4 words lingered in the air. The jury, which had thus far wrestled with testimony and forensic analyses, now faced what might be the most incriminating evidence of all. Diddy's own handwriting confirming an instruction to reroute $1 million from the charitable foundation's reserve account into what appeared to be a private investment fund. Among the spectators, there were gasps, some sharp enough to betray shock, others more subdued but just as telling. A retired teacher in the front row pinched the bridge of her nose, as if bracing against the revelation. A young man in a hoodie pulled his phone from his pocket, snapping a covert photo of the screen, perhaps to immortalize the moment on social media. Marcus Shaw, Diddy's defense attorney, was the first to rise. He buttoned his jacket with a firmness that suggested determination rather than agitation. In a voice that aimed for calm authority, he objected, "Your Honor, this is hearsay. We don't know who compiled this statement or how it came into the state's possession. We've not established chain of custody." The defense table shifted as Shaw's words moved through the room, and Diddy himself leaned back, eyebrows angled as though searching for some shred of legitimacy in Shaw's objection. Judge Caprio regarded Shaw with a steady gaze that spoke volumes, compassion blended with unwavering commitment to the law. He replied quietly, but in a tone that carried across the hushed courtroom, "Ms. Ramirez, has this document been authenticated by a qualified witness?" His words invited Ramirez to confirm the statement's legitimacy rather than argue its admissibility. Ramirez nodded briskly. "Yes, Your Honor. Our forensic accountant, Mr. Alex Mendez, will verify the handwriting and chain of custody. We request the court's permission to proceed." Caprio allowed a moment for the judge's clerk to prepare the witness stand. Then, without a hint of impatience, he said, "Very well. Call the witness." It was a pivotal moment. The court had accepted that the newly introduced evidence warranted expert authentication. Into the witness seat stepped Alex Mendez, a man whose very demeanor exuded meticulousness. His frame was lean, and he wore wire-rimmed glasses that perched on a straight nose. Mendez's dark brown hair was neatly combed, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up just below the elbow, as if ready to dive into a stack of files at any moment. He had the aura of someone for whom precision was a guiding principle, and his calm confidence seemed almost surgical. Ramirez guided Mendez through the expert testimony with careful precision. She began by asking him to state his qualifications. Mendez cleared his throat. "I am a certified forensic accountant specializing in handwriting analysis. I hold a master's degree in accounting from Northeastern University and have worked for the past 8 years on white-collar crime investigations, including high-profile cases involving alleged financial misconduct." The jury nodded along as he spoke. They recognized the weight of his credentials, the years of training that had prepared him to untangle the most complex of financial webs. Then came the critical question. Had Mendez examined the handwritten annotations on the newly introduced financial statement? He nodded, sliding a pair of latex gloves onto his hands as a symbolic gesture of careful handling. "Yes," he said, voice measured. "I was provided with the original document, as well as exemplar samples of Mr. Combs's handwriting, signed contracts, letters, and autographed memorabilia. I conducted a thorough comparative analysis, examining stroke patterns, pressure points, and slant angles." A murmur rippled through the jury. It was rare, they knew, to find handwriting so uniquely matched, especially on a document as consequential as this. Mendez continued, "My analysis shows that the handwriting on the financial statement matches Mr. Combs's handwriting with a 97% probability. Specifically, I compared the curvature of the capital C in Combs, the angling of the descending loops in the Ys, and the spacing between numerical figures. These characteristics consistently align with known samples of his writing. The screen behind Mendez displayed side-by-side comparisons, a scanned autograph card signed by Diddy and the notation in question. Jurors studied the loops and curves, their eyes traversing the angles that seemed to confirm truth. One juror, a middle-aged stockbroker, perched on the edge of his seat, scribbling notes at top speed. Another, a teacher with reading glasses perched on her nose, leaned forward, lips slightly parted. The gallery buzzed beneath the threshold of conversation, an undercurrent of astonishment at how incontrovertible the evidence appeared. When Mendez concluded, Shaw rose for cross-examination. He adopted a tone that tried to suggest reasonable doubt rather than outright denial. "Mr. Mendez, you indicated a 97% probability. Does that mean there's still a 3% chance this handwriting could belong to someone else?" Mendez met Shaw's gaze directly, unflinching. "Technically, yes. No forensic analysis can claim absolute certainty. But a 97% match in handwriting analysis is considered conclusive for courtroom purposes. That level of similarity is virtually indistinguishable from Mr. Combs's known handwriting patterns." Undeterred, Shaw pressed on. Could someone have forged those signatures? What if the document itself was backdated or manipulated by an opportunistic third party? Mendez responded patiently. If that were the case, there would need to be evidence of alterations, telltale signs like ink inconsistencies, pressure irregularities from pen lifts, or margin anomalies. My examination showed no such indicators. The ink used is consistent with other samples from the same time period, mid-2022 ballpoint pen. There are no signs of erasure or ink layering that would suggest a later edition. Shaw paused, then asked a final question, one meant to widen the gap between conviction and doubt. "Mr. Mendez, who provided you with the so-called anonymous source? Can you vouch for how that source obtained the statement? Perhaps they had ulterior motives." Mendez shook his head. "I did not meet the anonymous source. I was only provided with the document itself, which had a verified chain of custody, binding seals from the FBI task force investigating the case. The court's evidence log confirms that authenticity." Shaw sat down, defeated, his questions having inadvertently reinforced the statement's validity. As Mendez returned to his seat, the jurors exchanged glances that betrayed a mixture of curiosity and unease. They had expected some accounting minutiae, but this was far more damning. Diddy's own handwriting on a document that appeared to redirect charitable funds straight into his personal holdings. Ramirez seized this momentum. "Your Honor, the state calls its next witness, investigator Thomas Nguyen, to attest to the chain of custody of this document." Nguyen, a compact man in his early 40s with closely cropped hair, rose and took the stand. He bore the tangible gravitas of law enforcement, police-issue trousers, polished shoes, and a plainclothes detective's badge clipped to his belt. He explained how the statement had been recovered, found tucked within a locked file cabinet in the Unsolved Files unit, turned in by an informant whose name remained confidential. "The informant indicated fear of retaliation," Nguyen said. "They slipped the document under the door at my local precinct, accompanied by a note, 'Tell the truth.'" Nguyen presented a sealed envelope, unbroken, but for the official state evidence sticker bearing dates and initials. The jury observed as Ramirez peeled back the seal and handed the glossy document, its paper slightly creased at the edges, to Nguyen. He recited the chain of custody. "I received it on March 12, 2023, from that individual. I logged it immediately into Evidence Locker 7B. On March 14th, I transferred it to the Crime Lab's Forensic Division. It remained there until subpoenaed by this court on May 2, 2024. That final date, May 2, 2024, hung like a question mark in the minds of jurors. Why had such critical evidence waited so long to surface? But the chain of custody, as meticulously recounted, nullified Shaw's earlier objections. Ramirez sat down, satisfied that the jury now had enough context to regard the statement as authentic and relevant. As the tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch, Ramirez delivered the coup de grace, a clandestine audio recording captured on Karoline's old phone. The gallery collectively leaned forward as Ramirez hit play. The overhead speakers crackled for a moment before launching into the unmistakable timbre of Diddy's voice, recorded earlier that year in a private studio lounge. The sound was crisp, the words chillingly casual, as if discussing a trade deal rather than the diversion of funds meant to feed hungry children. Diddy's voice, relaxed, casual. We'll call it marketing expenses. Nobody checks once I greenlight it. The jurors' jaws tightened. Some gripped the arms of their chairs. Diddy himself looked as though struck, his eyes darting to his attorney, to Karoline, and then to the jury. His breath hitched slightly. On the recording, one of his associates, unidentified but laughing, said, "You sure no one'll question $1 million here and there?" The laughter was easy, unpolished, as though betraying years of comfortable secrecy. Then came Diddy again. "With my name on it? They'll sign off blind." The recording ended, leaving a low hum of silence that felt heavier than any spoken word. In that suspended moment, the jury seemed frozen. The reality of what they had just heard, Diddy's own voice admitting to the misdirection of funds, pressed down on every consciousness in the room. Reporters glanced at each other, pencils paused mid-scribe, and in the gallery, spectators exchanged looks that ranged from grim resignation to outright shock. Even Diddy's most ardent public supporters, seated in a cluster behind the defense table, looked uncertain, as if glimpsing for the first time the man they had idolized. Judge Caprio, ever the guardian of decorum, allowed no immediate reaction. He tapped the bench softly. "Are there any questions regarding the authenticity of that recording?" he asked, voice resonant. A juror mimed a shake of the head. Another, a young woman with braided hair and a notepad, adjusted her glasses before writing another note. No questions were forthcoming. Shaw stood to make a last-ditch effort. "Your Honor, we move to strike this tape from the record. It is prejudicial, and we have not been given an opportunity to authenticate the voices fully." Yet his words felt hollow in the wake of what the jurors had just heard. Caprio's face remained impressively calm as he responded, "The jury has heard the recording. Counsel's objection is noted, but the recording stands. We proceed." As the recorded confession settled into the courtroom's collective memory, Diddy lowered his head and closed his eyes for an instant, as if bracing himself against a physical blow. He whispered something to Shaw, indistinct, but the jury could see the quiver in his tone. Shaw shook his head slightly, as though conceding that their defenses were crumbling. Seeing the toll the revelation had exacted, Judge Caprio allowed a momentary reprieve. At precisely 36 minutes past the hour, he called for a brief recess. 10 minutes. The courtroom is in recess. The gavel's sound perforated the stunned silence, dispelling it like a signal flare. Spectators rose, stretching limbs stiffened by tension, while journalists retrieved phones to capture the stunned reaction of jurors and attendees. Outside the jury box, those 12 individuals filed out in pairs, frequently exchanging glances that conveyed more than words ever could. In the gallery, clusters formed as people whispered the unthinkable. He practically confessed on tape. This was more than mismanagement. It was a deliberate scheme. A local teacher muttered under her breath, "I hope this means justice for those kids." A friend of Karoline's wiped tears from her eyes, her hand trembling slightly as she spoke. She was terrified to reveal that, but thank God she did. At the defense table, Diddy sat expressionless, His broad frame slumped forward as though weary of the fight. His shoulders sagged, and he stared at the grain of the wooden table, tracing its lines with a finger as if seeking comfort in the bench itself. Marcus Shaw leaned back in his chair, massaging his temples, eyes squeezed shut. He had rallied all the arguments he could muster, but none could refute the handwritten statement or the recorded confession. Shaw exhaled deeply, as though releasing years of legal practice in a single breath. A young investigator at their side exchanged a worried look with Shaw. He had spent nights combing through records for an exculpatory detail, but now seemed to grasp that their case might be beyond saving. Meanwhile, the judge lingered at the bench, gazing steely-eyed at the empty jury box. He appeared to be piecing together a complex puzzle. The facts so meticulously laid out by the prosecution, the passions laid bare by Karoline's testimony, and now this damning evidence. Caprio closed his eyes momentarily, perhaps replaying what he had heard, its resonance echoing in the hush of the courtroom. He pushed back his chair slowly, his robes rustling softly, then leaned forward on the bench, hands clasped. The long pause that followed was weighted with the unspoken. The trial had changed irrevocably, shifting from disputed managerial decisions to undeniable admission of guilt. Exactly 10 minutes later, the bailiff's voice rang out again. "All rise. Jury entering." The clock on the wall marked 40 minutes past the hour. Jurors re-entered, some staring straight ahead, while others cast nervous glances at Diddy. They resumed their seats, the gravity of what they had witnessed still heavy in their expressions. Judge Caprio rapped the gavel twice, restoring order. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you have heard new evidence that may alter your perspective. Continue listening with open minds and hearts." As he delivered those words, all eyes returned to the bench. Caprio's calm assurance offered a sort of refuge in the storm of revelations. The jurors settled, pens ready, minds racing. The spectators stilled, cameras poised, breaths held. And Diddy, seated at the defense table, finally raised his head. His eyes, once flickering with defiance or denial, now exhibited resignation, the understanding that a turning point had arrived. The course of the trial was forever changed. In those final moments before the next witness took the stand, the courtroom felt charged with an almost electric intensity. The outcome, once uncertain, now pressed upon every juror with undeniable weight. Judge Caprio, perceiving that silence and focus would serve justice better than any further interruption, simply nodded and said, "Proceed." Thus, as the next witness rose to testify, the courtroom, once alive with tension, curiosity, and doubt, settled into an unspoken realization. This case had transcended questions of charity bookkeeping and veered straight into the realm of moral reckoning. And when the next words were spoken, they would be heard not just as testimony, but as the final stanza in a story of trust, betrayed, and a community demanding accountability. The atmosphere in Judge Caprio's courtroom was thick with expectation as the clock neared 40 minutes past the hour. Every eye remained riveted on the bench, where the judge, robes draped solemnly, surveyed the well of spectators, the jury box, and both tables of counsel. The prosecution had just rested, marking an important procedural milestone. It was now up to the defense to decide if they had any rebuttal witnesses. As Prosecutor Elena Ramirez retreated to her seat, she exchanged a brief, determined glance with Karoline Leavitt, who sat poised in the front row. Karoline's hands were folded neatly in her lap, her knuckles faintly white from the tension of automated focus. Her breath hitched slightly, but her face remained composed, an outward calm masking the emotional weight she bore. She had already testified twice, her words laying bare a journey from idealism to disillusionment, but she braced herself for what would come next. Marcus Shaw, Diddy's defense attorney, sat at the defense table, his expression carefully unreadable. When the judge asked if they intended to call any rebuttal witnesses, Shaw shook his head in a barely perceptible manner. The implication was clear. They had reached the end of their available evidence. Diddy sat beside Shaw, his towering frame hunched slightly forward, elbows resting on the polished wood. He stared at the surface of the desk, as though counting the wood grain, or perhaps summoning the resolve to face what was next. At that moment, with no rebuttal forthcoming, Caprio's gavel tapped once, twice, releasing an almost palpable exhale from the room. It was time for closing statements and final remarks. At 4100 on the courtroom clock, Judge Caprio rose to address the assembled crowd. His bearing was both compassionate and authoritative, as it had been throughout the trial, but now there was an unmistakable gravity in his tone, as if he felt the weight of every word keenly, knowing it would frame the jurors' deliberations. "We have seen evidence that suggests Mr. Combs knowingly directed funds away from charitable uses into personal accounts," he began, voice resonant, yet soft enough to feel intimate in the hushed chamber. His gaze swept first to Diddy, who remained seated, his posture taut, and then to Karoline, whose shoulders squared as she met his eyes. Yet, even a man with great influence may find himself at a crossroads, where the right path is unclear until the moment of decision arrives. I intend to hear any final statements before determining an appropriate outcome. As the judge's words settled, Ramirez stood and walked confidently back to the lectern. Her shuffle of papers was measured. Each step seemed to reverberate in the hush, reminding everyone that the prosecution's moment to speak was precious, and it had to count. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, casting her gaze over the 12 men and women who held Diddy's fate in their hands. "We have presented testimony from Coach McAllister, who detailed Mr. Combs's initial pledge of $10 million, only 2 of which were ever delivered to our community center accounts. We heard from Ms. Leavitt, who revealed the intimate, painful moments when she saw checks rerouted and watched families suffer. We heard from forensic accountant Mr. Mendez, whose meticulous analysis tied Mr. Combs's own handwriting to instructions diverting funds. And finally, we heard that chilling recording, Mr. Combs's own words, discussing how to disguise $1 million as marketing expenses. Taken together, these facts demonstrate a willful pattern of misdirection." Ramirez paused, allowing the jury to absorb the cumulative weight of evidence. Jurors exchanged subtle looks. Some folded their arms, others tapped pens against their notebooks. Even Diddy, who had previously looked steadfast, now shifted uneasily, as though those details had begun to crystallize into undeniable guilt. Ramirez let her next sentence land slowly. "Your Honor, innocence or guilt does not hinge on Mr. Combs's fame or philanthropy. It hinges on whether he deliberately deceived donors, parents, and children who trusted him. We trust that justice will prevail here, protecting those children who were let down and ensuring accountability for every dollar diverted, no matter how famous the defendant." When Ramirez sat, a solemn hush followed. Then Shaw rose for his closing remarks, his customary polish noticeably tempered by gravity. He walked deliberately to the lectern, leaning on it lightly as he addressed the jury. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, voice low but steady. "I have defended many high-profile clients over the years. I have seen cases where evidence appears damning, only to be unraveled by a careful, dispassionate examination. But this is the first case where I feel compelled to acknowledge undeniable wrongdoing by my client. Mr. Combs deeply regrets any harm caused, both to the children impacted and to those who believed in his charitable mission. Yes, he may have committed acts that violated the trust of donors, but he has also given a lifetime to philanthropy, building schools, providing scholarships, and standing on stages to plead for community support. We ask you to weigh the full life of Sean Combs, not just the moments his judgment faltered. As Shaw spoke, he slowly turned to look at Diddy. The rapper's stiff posture softened just a fraction, as though his attorney's words offered a tenuous lifeline. Shaw continued, "He accepts responsibility. He is prepared to pay restitution, returning every penny diverted, plus more. He stands ready to work side by side with those families, rebuilding what was broken. We ask for mercy, not to evade punishment, but to allow Mr. Combs to redeem himself, to continue serving the community that has given him so much." Shaw paused, his gaze sweeping the jury one last time before he stepped back. "Thank you." The courtroom remained still for a heartbeat, an almost eerie silence that spoke volumes. All eyes turned to Diddy. Slowly and deliberately, he rose from his chair, his expression unreadable at first. He cleared his throat, and the room leaned in, sensing something momentous unfolding. His voice, when it emerged, was softer than anyone expected, tempered by remorse, but unsteady with emotion. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pausing as though carefully choosing his words. "I built a life of giving, or at least I thought I did. When I launched the foundation, I believed every dollar I raised would help kids like those in Providence, like those whose faces I saw when we handed out backpacks full of school supplies. But in these past months, I've justified my actions by saying I'd put things right later, that no child would go without because of me." His shoulders sagged slightly, and he looked down, his head dipping as though he carried the weight of every unmet promise. "But I realize now that good intentions don't excuse deception. Letting $1 million be redirected, calling it marketing expenses, threatened the futures of those kids. I should have spoken up when the first envelope slipped into a private account. I should have said no when I felt pressure to cover costs I knew weren't charity expenses. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to Karoline, to the families, and to every person whose trust I stole, and to my mother, who taught me that a man's word is his bond." His voice wavered, and he swallowed hard, as though fighting the urge to break down. The stenographer's fingers hovered briefly over the keyboard, then stilled entirely, capturing not only the words, but the hushed sorrow in their delivery. He continued, tone resolute despite the tremor in his voice. "I ask for your forgiveness, though I know it may not be earned. I ask for the chance to repair the damage, to be more than the mistakes I made. If I end up behind bars, so be it. But I hope this court will allow me to make restitution in a way that benefits the very people I harmed. I want to rebuild the community centers, ensure those after-school programs run for decades, and personally mentor the next generation. I want to prove that I am more than my failures." Diddy looked up, meeting the judge's eyes briefly, then directed his gaze toward Karoline, who sat motionless, tears glistening in her eyes. She bowed her head slightly, as if accepting his apology, but uncertain of its capacity to heal her wounds. Moments passed that felt like lifetimes in the hush, a charged stillness where empathy, anger, and broken trust all flickered across individual faces. Judge Caprio permitted Diddy to resume his seat. Then, turning to the jury, he spoke in a voice that seemed to emanate from deep within, a blend of compassion, moral clarity, and judicial authority. "You have heard remorse. You have heard apologies. Now, you must weigh those against the facts. But before I ask for your verdict, I want to say this." He paused, leaning forward, his hands flat on the bench. "Mr. Combs, we measure a life by the good you do and the harm you cause. The court acknowledges your contributions to social causes, your efforts to provide scholarships, health clinics, and safe spaces for children. But we also must acknowledge the trust you violated and the real families who suffered the consequences. It is my duty to fashion a resolution that accounts for both, balancing punishment and restoration. He took a calming breath and offered Diddy a compassionate glance. Then he turned to Karoline, who had risen to her feet at Caprio's earlier request. Her presence, tall and dignified, commanded attention. Her tears had been wiped away, replaced by an expression of steadfast resolve. The judge's voice softened as he addressed her directly. "Ms. Leavitt, your courage in coming forward has been remarkable. Today, you have shown an integrity that this court, and indeed our entire community, values deeply. You risked everything to speak the truth. For that, this court thanks you." He allowed a moment for Karoline to absorb his words. She bowed her head slightly, eyes closed, as though drawing strength from his acknowledgement. At 4800 hours, the judge turned to the clerk. "Will the jury please rise?" The jurors stood, one by one, filing past Diddy and Karoline with solemn expressions. Their exit carried a certain weight. They were not simply leaving the courtroom for deliberations. They were stepping into a sacred civic duty, tasked with interpreting the evidence, the remorse, and rendering a verdict that would ripple far beyond these walls. Each juror cast one last glance at the defendant and the primary witness, as though seeking some final clarity before retreating to an enclosed deliberation room. As the courtroom emptied of its improvised audience, journalists rising to gather their gear, local residents murmuring in small clusters, law students furiously scribbling notes, the press assembled beyond the doors, cameras at the ready. They would soon capture the verdict and broadcast it, the culmination of months' worth of anticipation. But within the wood-paneled chamber, a hush lingered that no outside lens could see. The judge sat pensively at his bench, fingers steepled, eyes distant. He recalled countless moments on the bench, some petty disputes resolved with a firm word, others lives transformed by compassion or turned around by stern admonition. In each case, he had grappled with the delicate balance of mercy and accountability, of ensuring that justice did more than punish. It healed. He closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the families who sat in those very pews, some torn by outrage, others hopeful that a landmark ruling could restore faith in the power of charity. He thought of Karoline, whose unwavering testimony had anchored the entire trial in moral truth. He regretted that she had to sacrifice so much to bring the facts to light. He recalled Diddy's apology. Even if it could not erase the consequences, it carried the kernel of redemption that he believed the law should ideally allow. Finally, he thought of the children who had once packed that community center, their futures uncertain, their trust upended by the actions of a man they had trusted implicitly. Turning to his clerk, he spoke with firm resolve. "Let's proceed." The words were both simple and weighty, the final cue that the solemn deliberations would begin. His gavel tapped twice, reverberating off the courtroom's high ceiling, a forceful punctuation that bridged the space between emotion and judgment. And as he seated himself again, he carried within him the understanding that, regardless of the jury's eventual verdict, today's proceedings had already altered countless lives. In a world where power and privilege often skewed the scales of justice, the trial had become a crucible, testing not only one man's conscience, but the very essence of what it meant to do right by the vulnerable. In Judge Caprio's chamber, that day's conclusion was not simply about verdicts and sentences. It was about the fragile, unbreakable promise that justice, guided by empathy, could mend what had been broken. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, their expressions carried a hushed gravity that immediately settled over every person present. The bailiff rapped the gavel once, twice, and Judge Caprio rose, his robes rustling softly as he took his place behind the bench. The foreperson, a woman in her 40s, with close-cropped curly hair and clear, steady eyes, stood slowly, smoothing the crease of her blazer. she offered a brief nod toward the judge before addressing the court. "Your Honor, we find the defendant, Sean Combs, guilty of conspiracy to defraud and embezzlement of charitable funds." At the utterance of guilty, a collective breath escaped from the assembly, as though the entire room had been holding it in anticipation of that single word. Some spectators leaned back against the mahogany benches, faces slack with relief, as though the verdict had lifted a heavy weight they had carried since the trial began. A few in the gallery, parents whose children had once depended on those after-school programs, exhaled sobs of vindication, wiping tears from their cheeks as though the tears were the very proof they had waited for. Others, perhaps longtime fans or friends of Mr. Combs, brows furrowed in heartbreak, eyes reddened. The man himself, Sean Combs, sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit that now seemed ill-fitting across his broad shoulders. As the verdict was read, his posture slumped forward, as though the words had struck him like physical blows. His shoulders drooped, and he stared at the polished wood of the table before him, jaw clenched so tightly that his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge. For a moment, the hush was so profound that one could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning, a soft undertone to the tumult of emotion swirling in the courtroom. Judge Caprio allowed a brief, respectful pause before he spoke, letting the echo of the foreperson's announcement settle. "Mr. Combs," he began in a tone both measured and compassionate, "the jury has spoken. In making my final decision today, I will consider the severity of your actions, your contributions to this community, and your sincere remorse." Diddy's head snapped up at the mention of his name, his eyes, normally so guarded, flickering with that tremor of vulnerability reserved for moments when reputation and consequence collide. Judge Caprio continued, "You have failed an entire network of children who trusted in your commitment." At these words, Ms. Karoline Leavitt, a primary witness in the case, shifted in her seat. Her lips pressed together as though bracing herself, her gaze straight ahead. The judge next addressed Karoline directly. "Ms. Leavitt, your testimony was both brave and necessary. You have helped restore faith in our justice system. The court recognizes your sacrifice." Karoline held her hands at her sides as she rose briefly, offering a graceful nod to both the judge and the jury. Tears glistened at the corners of her eyes, and she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, as though attempting to maintain composure in this deeply emotional moment. The weight of her journey, from idealistic intern to disillusioned whistleblower, seemed to reverberate in the hush that followed Judge Caprio's acknowledgement. Turning his attention back to the defendant, Judge Caprio said, "Mr. Combs, this court notes and commends the steps you have already begun to take toward restitution, meeting with the families affected, contributing your personal funds to repair the after-school facilities, and publicly acknowledging the harm done. Such actions may mitigate your sentence, but they do not nullify it." Diddy, still seated, looked toward the families in the gallery, then toward Karoline, blinking rapidly as tears escaped his eyes. He reached up to dab at one eye with a handkerchief, visibly gathering himself for what he knew would be the judge's sentence. At precisely 53 minutes on the courtroom clock, Judge Caprio delivered the judgment in a voice that blended resoluteness with compassion. "Sean Combs," he said, locking eyes with the defendant, "this court sentences you to 5 years of supervised probation." There was a collective murmur among the spectators and jurors. Some nodded in approval, while others grimaced at the brevity of the sentence. Diddy's shoulders hunched yet again, as if the word probation carried a weight far heavier than prison bars. "You will complete 200 hours of community service, focusing on nonprofit management and youth programs. You will continue your pledges to the community centers you helped establish, ensuring that funds reach their intended recipients as originally intended. Finally, The judge paused, letting his gaze sweep over the audience. This court orders you to submit a public written apology, acknowledging the harm that was done and expressing a sincere commitment to repair it. May this judgment serve as both reparation to those you've hurt and as a reminder that privilege carries with it profound responsibility. As those sentencing terms fell into place, the courtroom responded in a chorus of subdued reactions. The jurors exchanged looks that combined relief and solemnity, marked by the recognition that while the outcome offered accountability, it also urged healing and repair. For many, probation rather than incarceration felt appropriate, given Diddy's actions to address the wrongs and his willingness to reinvest in the community. But for a few, particularly parents who had lost trust, that leniency stung. Some pressed their lips in frustration, silently questioning whether it was enough. Diddy let out a soft, reverent nod, tears pooling in his eyes as he wiped them with the handkerchief. When the sentence was complete, he bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the judge's words and the responsibilities they imposed. At once, his broad frame seemed both diminished and softened by the weight of emotion. Karoline, too, discreetly brushed a tear from her cheek, though her stance remained resolute. Her sacrifice, exposing corruption that had turned charity into personal gain, had contributed directly to this moment of public reckoning. Judge Caprio then addressed the courtroom at large, opening his arms as if encompassing everyone present. "Remember," he said, voice resonant, "justice extends beyond mere punishment. It seeks restoration, not merely retribution. May we all learn from this case that accountability and compassion can and must coexist." The gavel tapped sharply, echoing over the polished hardwood floor and signaling the formal conclusion of proceedings. As the gavel's echo faded, spectators slowly rose from their seats. Many reached for tissues, wiping away tears sparked by the trial's emotional journey. Some whispered words of closure to their neighbors, while others simply remained still, savoring a moment of collective exhalation. Outside the jury box, the 12 jurors rose in unison, filing past Diddy and Karoline as they made their way toward the exit. Several jurors offered Karoline respectful nods, while a few lingered near Diddy's table, their eyes conveying a flicker of hope that this fallen icon might indeed use probation and restitution as a genuine turning point, a chance to transform remorse into action. Reporters hovered near the rail, pens poised, capturing every nuanced expression for the evening news. A camera in the corner trained on Diddy's face, eyes red, still glistening, ready to broadcast his reaction to millions of viewers who had followed the trial's drama from their living rooms. At end, Judge Caprio had concluded the official proceedings, and the room seemed to pulse with the moral crystallization of the case. The trial's essence, truth, however painful, was the only path to healing. And as the crowd began to filter out, some hugging strangers who had sat beside them for 8 days of testimony, others exchanging satisfied nods, the air felt electrified by the promise of redemption. A handful of supporters remained behind, offering Diddy heartfelt words of encouragement. "You can rebuild from here. Use this chance wisely. We stand by you if you stay true to your word." His head bobbed with earnest gratitude, though he could not yet speak without trembling. A young volunteer who'd once managed the charity's basketball clinics approached Karoline, whispering, "Thank you for telling the truth. I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't spoken up." Karoline gave a small, tired smile, squeezing the volunteer's hand and nodding in silent solidarity. The press swarmed like bees once the doors opened, jostling for quick sound bites. Reporters asked Diddy to comment. He raised one hand, offering a few halting words. "I understand my sentence. I am committed to repairing the damage. My life's work will now focus on real, tangible change." Karoline, circled by photographers, simply said, Justice was done today. I hope others will feel they can speak up when they see wrong. With those brief statements, the outside world was given enough to shape headlines and fuel social media debates well into the night. In the quiet of his private chambers later that day, Judge Caprio allowed himself a moment alone. He sat behind his desk, its surface strewn with notes and legal briefs from the trial, each document a testament to weeks of testimony, evidentiary exchanges, and personal sacrifice. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, replaying the faces he had seen. Coach McAllister's steady demeanor, Karoline's courage, Diddy's expressions oscillating between defiance and remorse, the juror's intent focus. In his memory, he saw that final tableau, the judge offering words of both admonishment and compassion, the defendant's head bowed in silent acknowledgement, the unanimous nod of Karoline accepting the verdict as a moral vindication. For Caprio, the deliberation was not merely about finding a balance between punishment and mercy. It was about ensuring that the system upheld its promise to the vulnerable. He thought of the children whose after-school centers had closed, the families who'd struggled with rent and lost jobs because of unfulfilled pledges, the volunteers who had given their best to a cause that turned out to be tainted by misappropriation. He reminded himself that privilege, like Diddy's fame and resources, must never be allowed to eclipse accountability. Yet he also held close the belief that redemption was possible when someone truly grasped the gravity of their mistakes and took steps to correct them. On his desk, a photograph lingered in a simple silver frame. A young immigrant mother he had once helped in a minor fine dispute, now thriving as a small business owner. Next to it, a letter from a former college student he had granted leniency to, thanking the court for a second chance that had allowed her to graduate. Those reminders of restoration and hope illuminated his reflections. He realized that while the verdict had been guilty, the sentence and its conditions offered a chance at restorative justice, an opportunity for Diddy to convert remorse into real, positive impact. As dusk settled beyond the courthouse windows, Judge Caprio rose and straightened his robes. He gazed out over the city skyline, where streetlights began to flicker on, mirroring the courtroom's own transition from confrontation to resolution. He closed his eyes for a moment and whispered a private benediction, that those affected by this trial, children, families, whistleblowers, and even the defendant himself, would find a path to healing. With deliberate grace, he collected his notes, retrieved his gavel, and prepared to leave the chambers. Outside, the crunch of footsteps on marble signaled his departure, a quiet echo that carried with it the enduring message of that day's proceedings. Truth might be hard to bear, but only by facing it head-on could genuine healing begin. As the courtroom emptied, a voice echoed under the lofty ceiling. If you've watched this far, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit subscribe so you won't miss our next courtroom stories, where hope, humanity, and justice intertwine. The echo of those final words lingered, inviting viewers to become part of a community that cherishes both accountability and compassion. And as the lights dimmed on this chapter of Sean Combs's life, a new promise glowed, that no voice would go unheard, no story untold.